"Before anyone touches that settlement agreement," I said, "I need to share something with this room." The mediator looked up from his notepad. My wife's attorney, a polished woman in a charcoal blazer whose name I had already forgotten twice, stopped mid-sentence. My wife sat across the mahogany table from me, perfectly composed in the way she had always been perfectly composed, like a photograph of a person rather than a person. She had that look she wore when she was absolutely certain she had already won something. I reached into the inside pocket of my jacket and set a USB drive on the table. My own attorney touched my arm. We had talked about this. He had advised patience, negotiation, compromise. He was a reasonable man, and this was, in his estimation, a reasonable situation. Two people ending a 35-year marriage. Assets to be divided, a life to be untangled, painful, yes, complicated, certainly, but manageable. He didn't know what was on that drive. Neither did my wife. Not yet. Let me take you back to the beginning, because this story doesn't start in that conference room. It starts the way most real stories start, quietly. In a moment so ordinary you don't even recognize it as the moment everything changed. I am 63 years old. I spent 30 years building an engineering consulting firm from a folding table in my garage into a company with 42 employees and contracts across 8 states. My wife and I built it together, or I believed we did. She handled the books in the early years, the invoicing, the vendor relationships. Later, when the company grew, we brought in professionals, but her fingerprints were all over the foundation of everything I created. We raised 2 children in a house I bought with the first large contract we ever landed. My son is 31. My daughter is 28. Both of them grew up watching their parents work, argue, make up, work some more. I thought that was what a marriage looked like. I thought the friction was just the texture of a real life being lived. I sold the company 2 years ago, took a very good offer from a regional firm that wanted our client list and our reputation. The kind of exit that took 30 years to earn and felt, for about 3 weeks, like pure relief. Then I retired. And retirement, as it turned out, was when everything I had missed became visible. When you work 80 hours a week, you don't notice things. The lunch meetings that run long. The weekends your wife is out with her book club that doesn't seem to have many books. The way her phone screen tilts away from you automatically. A reflex so practiced it doesn't even register as deliberate. You don't notice because you're tired and distracted, and frankly, after enough years of marriage, you stop watching your partner the way you once did. You trust them. That's what love becomes, eventually. Trust so deep it stops looking like trust and starts looking like assumption. Retirement gave me time to notice. The first thing I noticed was the savings account. Not anything dramatic, just a number that seemed lower than it should have been when I was reviewing our quarterly statements. We had always maintained 3 accounts: a checking account for daily expenses, a joint savings, and an investment account tied to my retirement portfolio. I was meticulous about the investment account. The savings account I had more or less handed over to my wife years ago because she was better at the administrative side of our finances and I had a company to run. The number in the savings account was off by enough that it bothered me. Not enough to panic, just enough to create a small, persistent itch in the back of my mind. I mentioned it to her. Casually, over dinner. She said she had moved some funds to cover a repair on her mother's house and had forgotten to tell me. Her mother was 81 and lived 2 states away, and there had always been something that needed fixing. I accepted the explanation because it was plausible and because I wanted to accept it. But the itch didn't go away. In December of last year, 2 months before my wife told me she wanted a divorce, I hired a forensic accountant. His name was Raymond Park, a quiet man in his late 50s who had spent 20 years working for the IRS before going private. He came, recommended by a colleague of mine who had gone through an ugly business dissolution 5 years earlier. My colleague described Raymond as the kind of man who finds what exists and does not find what doesn't. I told my wife I was having our accounts audited for tax planning purposes. She didn't blink. She said that was fine. Raymond worked for 6 weeks. He was thorough and methodical and communicated almost exclusively in spreadsheets. When he called me to deliver his findings, I was sitting in the kitchen at 7 in the morning, drinking coffee, watching birds at the feeder my wife had hung in the backyard the summer before. "Mr. Simmons," he said, "I need you to understand that what I'm about to tell you is documented and verifiable. Every number I give you has a paper trail attached to it." "Go ahead," I told him. "Over the past 4 years, approximately $340,000 has been moved out of your joint savings account through a series of transfers that were structured specifically to avoid triggering reporting thresholds. The money moved in increments, mostly between $2,000 and $9,000. Irregular intervals, different destination accounts each time." I set down my coffee. "Where did it go?" I asked. He told me. Most of it had passed through an account in my wife's name that I had not known existed. From there, it went to a business account registered to a company called Meridian Consulting Partners, LLC, incorporated in Delaware 3 years ago. I didn't recognize the name. I told him that. "The registered agent for Meridian Consulting Partners," he said, "is a man named Gerald Faust." The birds were still at the feeder. The coffee was still warm. The world looked completely normal. Gerald Faust had been my business partner for 11 years. We had founded the firm together, split equity 60-40, and when we sold it 2 years ago, we had each walked away with a sum of money that would have been unimaginable to the younger versions of ourselves. We had not been close friends exactly, but we had been something more than colleagues. I had been to his daughter's wedding. He had given a toast at my retirement dinner. When I thought about the people I trusted in my professional life, his name was near the top. He was also, I now understood, the man my wife had been funneling our money to for at least 4 years. "I need to ask you something," I told Raymond. "And I need you to tell me the truth, even if you think it's outside the scope of what I hired you for." He said he would. "Is there any legitimate business reason these transfers could have been made? Any scenario where this is something other than what it looks like?" There was a pause. "I've looked at this from every angle," he said. "There is no legitimate explanation for this transfer pattern. This was deliberate, structured, and concealed." I thanked him. I ended the call. I sat at the kitchen table for a long time. The birds finished at the feeder and flew away, and I watched the empty branches move in the cold December wind, and I tried to feel something definite. Anger, maybe, or grief. What I actually felt was closer to the specific exhaustion you feel when something you suspected for a long time finally becomes confirmed. Not shock, just the settling of a weight that had been hovering for years finally coming to rest. My wife told me she wanted a divorce 6 weeks later, on a Tuesday evening in February, with the calm efficiency of someone announcing a schedule change. She had a lawyer already. She had thought carefully about what she wanted. The house, which was in both our names. A substantial portion of my retirement accounts, which under our state's marital property laws she was entitled to claim. Spousal support, given that she had not maintained her own career for the last 2 decades, she was reasonable about it. That was what struck me. She was entirely reasonable, in the way a person is reasonable when they believe they have already secured what they actually want, and this conversation is a formality. I told her I wasn't going to fight her. I told her we would figure it out. I watched relief move across her face before she could control it. What I did not tell her was that I already knew about Raymond Park's findings. I did not tell her about the flash drive I had prepared with Raymond's full report, the documentation of every transfer, the registration papers for Meridian Consulting Partners, and a second report from a private investigator I had retained after speaking to Raymond, one whose work confirmed what the financial documents had implied. My wife and Gerald Faust had been in a relationship for at least 6 years. The money she had moved was not going toward any legitimate business. It was being used to fund a life she was building in parallel with the one we shared. A life she intended to step into once she finished stepping out of ours. I don't know exactly when I understood that I wasn't just dealing with a marriage ending. I was dealing with a fraud. A sustained, deliberate fraud against me by the 2 people, beyond my children, whom I had trusted most. What made it worse, what made it so much worse, was my son. He came to see me 3 weeks after my wife announced the divorce. He sat down across from me in the living room and told me that he thought I should be cooperative in the divorce process, that his mother had been unhappy for a long time, that he hoped I could understand and not make things difficult. I looked at my son and I asked him a question. "Have you been to Gerald Faust's house in the last year?" His face did something he didn't intend for it to do. A flicker. Barely a second, but I had known that face for 31 years. I had watched that face learn to walk, to read, to drive, to be a man. I knew every expression it was capable of making. He said that wasn't relevant. I told him it was relevant to me. He said he had run into Gerald at a family gathering, that Gerald was a friend of the family. I told him that was fine. We could talk more later. I thanked him for coming. He left, and I sat there understanding that my son had known, or known enough, and had chosen his mother's side of this before the sides were even declared. He had come to my house not to check on me, but to deliver a message, to soften me, to help ensure that I signed the papers without looking too closely at the details. My daughter was different. She called me every few days. She cried on the phone and asked if I was okay and told me she loved me and didn't understand why this was happening. If she knew anything, she gave no sign of it. I believed she didn't. I believed my wife had told her the minimum necessary and relied on my son for the rest. That distinction mattered to me more than I expected it to. I spent 2 months preparing. Raymond Park finished his documentation. The private investigator delivered his report. My attorney, once I showed him everything, stopped advising patients and started preparing for what he called a substantive legal strategy. He told me that what my wife had done met the legal standard for financial fraud in a marital context, and that the existence of an ongoing relationship with Gerald Faust constituted grounds for a renegotiated settlement under our state's fault statutes. I asked him what he recommended. He told me we could take this all the way to court and likely win a very favorable judgment. Or I could allow him to present the documentation in mediation and see if my wife's attorneys preferred to negotiate once they understood the full picture. I chose mediation, not because I was being merciful. Because I was 63 years old and I had already spent 30 years in rooms full of people arguing about money. I didn't want to spend the next year in a courtroom. I wanted this to be over. Which brings me back to the conference room, the USB drive on the table. My wife's carefully composed expression. Her attorney asked what was on the drive. My attorney told her that it contained a forensic accounting report, supporting financial documentation, and an investigative report compiled over the previous 4 months by a licensed private investigator. The composure didn't break. My wife was too controlled for that. But something behind it shifted. Her eyes moved from me to my attorney to the drive on the table and back to me. I watched her try to calculate. 35 years of marriage had taught me how her mind worked when it was running numbers. She was deciding how much I knew and whether it was enough. It was enough. Her attorney asked for a recess. My attorney said that was fine. We stepped out. My wife and her attorney remained in the conference room for 20 minutes. I drank bad coffee in the hallway and watched traffic move on the street below through a glass wall and thought about nothing in particular. When we went back in, her attorney had a different quality of attention. The professional smoothness was still there, but underneath it was something more careful. "Your client is prepared to discuss a modified settlement?" my attorney asked. They were. The house came off the table. My wife got a fair share of our marital assets as calculated without the fraudulently transferred funds, which were counted against her portion. She received no spousal support. The documentation of the transfers was submitted to our state's Attorney General's office as a matter of record. What happened after that was not within my control or my interest. Gerald Faust, I learned later, had his own legal problems to navigate once the paper trail became part of the official record. That was his to deal with. I drove home from that mediation the same way I had driven home from the office 10,000 times before. Same roads, same turns, same familiar landscape. Everything looked the same. Nothing was. There is a particular kind of grief that doesn't announce itself with tears or anger. It just settles into the ordinary spaces of your day. The kitchen that echoes differently when you're the only one in it. The second car that doesn't move from the driveway. The habit of cooking for two that takes longer to break than you expect. I was not a man who had lost everything. I understood that. I had my health, my financial security, the work of 30 years intact. I had my daughter, who called me every few days, and eventually started coming over on Sunday afternoons to watch football, which she hates, because she understood I needed company more than I needed to admit it. What I had lost was harder to name. Not the marriage itself, which I now understood had been something other than what I believed it was. What I had lost was the version of my past I had trusted, the 35 years that I had inhabited as something real and mutual. Knowing what I now knew, I had to go back through that time and understand it differently, not erase it, because it had still happened, but re-understand it. That process was not fast and it was not clean. My son called me 2 weeks after the mediation. He said he wanted to explain. I told him I was listening. He said he had not known the full picture. He had known that his mother was close with Gerald, had suspected it might be more than friendship, but hadn't wanted to know for certain. When the divorce was announced, his mother had asked him to be supportive of the process. He had done what she asked because he didn't understand what was actually happening. That's what he said. I sat with it for a while. I told him that I believed he was probably telling me the truth about not knowing the details. I told him I also believed he had made a choice about which direction to face when things got uncomfortable, and that choice had consequences for what came next between us. He was quiet. I told him I wasn't interested in punishing him. I was 63 years old. I didn't have the energy for punishment, and I didn't think it accomplished anything useful. But I also wasn't going to pretend that the way he had handled himself hadn't hurt me. We were going to have to rebuild something, and rebuilding takes time, and he needed to be patient with my pace. He said he understood. I don't know yet if he does. Some things you only know by watching someone over time. 6 months after the mediation, I moved into a house I bought in a neighborhood I had always liked, a quieter part of town with older trees and sidewalks where people actually walk. 2 bedrooms, a good kitchen, a yard that needed work. I spent 3 weekends in October clearing out the overgrowth in the back and pulling dead shrubs from along the fence line. It was honest, physical work. My back complained about it. I didn't care. My daughter came over on a Saturday in November with my granddaughter, who is 4 years old and has decided that helping with yard work means picking up individual leaves and handing them to you one at a time with great ceremony. We spent an hour in the backyard not accomplishing much of anything. I cannot tell you the last time I felt as uncomplicated as I did in that hour. At one point, my granddaughter looked up at me with the total sincerity that only belongs to 4-year-olds and said, "Grandpa, is this your house now?" "Yes," I told her. "This is my house." She considered that. She handed me another leaf. "Good," she said. "I like it." I looked at my daughter, who was smiling at us from the back steps with a coffee mug in her hands, and I felt something shift in my chest. Not the closing of a wound, exactly. More like the first moment when you realize the wound is not going to be permanent. Gerald Faust left the state. I heard this from a former colleague, not because I was asking, just the kind of information that finds you in a small professional community. I don't know what he and my wife worked out between themselves. I don't know if the life they were building together survived the collapse of the plan it was built on. I found, somewhat to my own surprise, that I was not particularly curious about it. What they did with whatever came next was not something I had any investment in. What I had investment in was my granddaughter handing me leaves in my own backyard. My daughter on the back steps. The kitchen, I was slowly learning to cook for 1 in, then for 2 when my daughter came over, then for 3 or 4 on Sundays when I started having people over. My son came to one of those Sundays in January. He brought his wife, who I have always liked and who had nothing to do with any of this. We ate together. The conversation was careful in the way conversation is when trust has been damaged and is being rebuilt in small increments. We didn't address the large things. We talked about his wife's work and a trip they were planning and what I was doing to fix up the yard. Before he left, he stopped in the doorway and said, "I'm sorry, Dad. Not for any one specific thing. For all of it." I told him I appreciated that. I told him I was working on it. That's the honest answer. There are things about the last year that I think about differently now than I did in the middle of them. When I found out about the money, my first instinct was to feel like a fool, like someone who had been willfully blind for years and deserved whatever had been taken from him. I sat with that feeling for a while. I let it occupy more space than it should have. Eventually, I understood something. I had trusted people I had reason to trust. My wife was my wife. My partner was my partner. Trusting them was not stupidity. Trusting them was reasonable. The failure of character was theirs, not mine. The choices they made were theirs. I didn't cause those choices. I didn't earn them. And I wasn't going to spend whatever years I have left carrying shame that belongs to other people. I built a company for 30 years. I showed up for my family for 35. I worked when I was tired and stayed when leaving would have been easier, and invested in things I believed were real. Some of what I invested in turned out to be built on something rotten underneath. That's a terrible thing. It is not a reflection of who I am. There is something I want to say to anyone watching this who is somewhere in the middle of their own version of this story. Not at the end, where I am now, where the dust has started to settle and the new life has started to feel like your actual life. But in the middle, where everything is still raw and the future looks like a blank wall. I know what that middle feels like. I remember sitting in my kitchen at 7 in the morning, listening to Raymond Park tell me in his measured, spreadsheet voice that the life I had built had a hole in it I hadn't known was there. I remember driving home from that mediation and feeling not triumphant but simply emptied. I remember my first night in this house, alone, in a bedroom I didn't recognize yet, thinking about 35 years and what they added up to. Here is what I know now that I didn't know then. The end of something false is not the same as the end of everything. When the structure that was built on dishonesty comes down, it feels like total loss. It isn't. What was real remains real. The work you did was real. The love you gave, even if it wasn't properly received, was real. The children you raised, the people you showed up for, all of that happened. All of that still counts. And the truth, even when it is catastrophically inconvenient, is better than the alternative. I thought about not looking too closely at those savings account numbers. I thought about accepting my wife's explanations and moving forward and choosing to not know what I clearly on some level already suspected. That path was available to me. I chose not to take it. And yes, what I found on the other side of that choice was painful. But I would rather carry honest pain than live inside a comfortable lie. I would rather know my life as it actually was than spend my remaining years inside a story that was being written by someone else for their own purposes. I'm 63 years old. I have a yard that still needs work in the back corner. I have Sunday dinners that are getting a little less careful each week. I have a granddaughter who has discovered that Grandpa's house has a bird bath that needs to be monitored closely and regularly reported on. She called me last week, or rather her mother held the phone up to her, and she said, "Grandpa, a bird was in the water. 2 birds. I told her that was excellent news. She said she would watch again tomorrow. That's the real work, I think. Not the mediation, not the documentation, not the legal maneuvering that put the truth on record where it belonged. Those things mattered, and I'm glad I did them. But the real work is the granddaughter with the bird bath. The son in the doorway saying he's sorry and meaning it, maybe, or learning to mean it. The daughter on the back steps with a coffee mug who shows up because she wants to, not because she owes anyone anything. The real work is building something again. Smaller this time, maybe. More carefully chosen. With a better understanding of what I'm actually looking at when I decide what to trust. My wife took 35 years and tried to reduce them to a transaction. She almost succeeded, but a transaction is a closed thing, done when the accounting is settled. What I have on the other side of this is not done. It's still going. My granddaughter will report on the birds tomorrow. My son and I will have another careful Sunday dinner, and it will be slightly less careful than the last one. My daughter will call on Tuesday the way she always calls on Tuesday. You cannot transact your way out of that. You cannot transfer that into a Delaware LLC and move it somewhere it doesn't belong to you. What is real stays real. That's what I know now. That's what I would have told myself 12 months ago if I could have. The worst moment of your life is not a verdict on who you are. It's a door. What matters is what you choose to do once you're standing on the other side of it. I chose to stay. To rebuild. To keep showing up for the people worth showing up for, and to stop measuring my life by what was taken instead of what remains. What remains is enough. More than enough. I've got to get outside before the light goes. That back corner of the yard isn't going to sort itself. But if you're somewhere in the middle of your own hard season, I hope something in this was useful. Leave a comment below if you've been through something like this. I read them. And if this found you at the right moment, share it with someone who might need to hear it. I'll see you in the next one.